So, New York Times, this is from Ryan Grimm. This freelancer, here it is. The New York Times is investigating an Israeli freelancer after she repeatedly liked multiple X posts that indicated a pro-Israel bias, including one that was called for the Gaza Strip to be turned into a slaughterhouse. Okay? This was a freelancer who played a lead role in the paper's most consequential coverage of war and had no journalism experience. The better question is who assigned her these stories, why, and what they were thinking. Now, this is from 4 days ago. Ryan found answers to this question in the latest coverage that they've done on the matter. Between the hammer and the anvil, the story behind the New York Times October 7 expose. Okay? Anat Schwartz had a problem. The Israeli filmmaker and former Air Force intelligence official had been assigned by the New York Times to work with her nephew, Adam Sella, and veteran Times reporter Jeffrey Gettleman on an investigation into sexual violence by Hamas on October 7 that could reshape the way the world understood Israel's ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. By November, global opposition was mounting against Israel's military campaign, which had already killed thousands of children, women, and the elderly. On her social media feed, which the Times has said since it is reviewing, Schwartz liked the tweet saying that Israel needed to turn the Strip into a slaughterhouse. Violate any norm on the way to victory, read the post. Those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. The New York Times, however, does have rules and norms. Schwartz had no prior reporting experience. Her reporting partner, Gettleman, explained the basics to her. Schwartz said in a podcast interview on January 3rd, produced by Israel's Channel 12 and conducted in Hebrew. Gettleman, she said, was concerned they get at least 2 sources for every detail we put in the article, cross-check information. Do we have forensic evidence? Do we have visual evidence? Apart from telling our readers this happened, what can we say? Can we tell what happened to whom? Schwartz said she was initially reluctant to take the assignment because she did not want to look at visual images of potential assaults and because she lacked the expertise to conduct such an investigation. Victims of sexual assault are women who have experienced something, and then to come and sit in front of such a woman, who am I anyway, she said. I have no qualifications. Nonetheless, she began working with Gettleman on the story. She explained in the podcast interview. Gettleman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, is an international correspondent, and when he is sent to a bureau, he works with news assistants and freelancers on stories. In this case, several newsroom sources familiar with the process said Schwartz and Sella did the vast majority of the ground reporting while Gettleman focused on the framing and writing. The resulting report, published in late December, was headlined, Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7. It was a bombshell and galvanized the Israeli war effort at a time when even some of Israel's allies were expressing concern over its large-scale killing of civilians in Gaza. It was a restatement of atrocity propaganda, the type of which that you immediately recognize when it's Rabbi Shmuley saying Hamas cut the breasts off of 500 women and chopped them and played football with them. That is atrocity propaganda of the highest magnitude. The New York Times is not going to reach that depth, obviously, because that's not good propaganda. That's the type of propaganda that people immediately go, okay, I don't believe that. By the way, what I just mentioned about Rabbi Shmuley is a quote. He quoted that numerous times in his conversation against Norm Finkelstein on Piers Morgan's talk show. He said that as though it was a matter of fact. It was not. Of course it wasn't. Now, let me explain something. And I'm going to run the top of the hour ad break right now. And then, I'm not doing a segue. This is serious coverage. Let me explain something. Sexual assaults, rapes, and the like are a routine part of atrocities during war. It can happen, and it has happened time and time again, which is why there is a likelihood that it could have happened on October 7th. This is a position that I've maintained since October 7th. There were plenty of atrocities that occurred on October 7th, okay, that are akin to acts of terror. Absolutely. Because on October 7th, it wasn't just the Palestinian Brigades, a coalition of resistance forces that includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, and many others. It was also, once the barrier into Israel was broken, there was also criminal elements that broke through said barrier. Okay? But as far as we saw, given how much of what happened on October 7 was filmed, including the actual, like, real atrocities of Palestinian forces executing civilians, shooting at porta potties and the like during the Nova festival, and many other circumstances, the likelihood that there wasn't any firsthand accounts on rampant sexual assault in the way that the original coverage entailed, that didn't meet the muster, like the normal standard of the New York Times reporting, is crazy. Okay, there are some reasons for it, because this was, for all intents and purposes, as far as the Palestinian resistance goes, a operation that was, in their own words, much more successful than they had predicted. They thought that there would be a lot more resistance overall, and that once the dam broke, there was a shit ton more violence than a quick in and out operation where they would be able to capture some prisoners of war as hostages in an effort to bargain, in an effort to negotiate with the Israeli apartheid regime. In that chaos, there was absolutely a majority of civilians that were slaughtered, executed in their homes, executed when they were going about their daily lives. Okay? It was horrifying. Inside the newsroom, the article was met with praise from editorial leaders, but skepticism from other Times journalists. The paper's flagship podcast, The Daily, attempted to turn the article into an episode, but it didn't manage to get through a fact check, as Intercept previously reported. If you recall, because the Daily episode was released and quickly taken off the air because it failed. It failed the New York Times' own standards. As the Times faces scrutiny for its coverage of Israel's war on Gaza, it has capitulated to the pro-Israel media watchdog Camera. Camera is another Hasbro operation, but we're not going to get into that right now. They pulled a high-profile episode of its podcast, The Daily, about sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7 amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject. The Times newsroom told sources, told The Intercept, the episode had been scheduled for January 9 and was based on a prominent article led by Pulitzer Prize winner Jeffrey Gettleman, claiming that Hamas had systematically used sexual violence as a weapon of war. The fear among Times staffers who had been critical of the paper's Gaza coverage is that Schwartz will become a scapegoat for what is a much deeper failure. She may harbor animosity towards Palestinians, lack the experience with investigative journalism, and feel conflicting pressures between being a supporter of Israel's war effort and a Times reporter. But Schwartz did not commission herself and her nephew to report one of the most consequential stories of the war. Senior leadership at the New York Times did. Schwartz said as much in an interview with the Israeli Army radio on December 31st. The New York Times said, "Let's do an investigation into sexual violence. It was more of a case of them having to convince me," she said. Her host cut her off. "It was a proposal of the New York Times, the entire thing?" Unequivocally, obviously, of course, she said. The paper stood behind us 200% and gave us the time, the investment, the resource to go in depth with this investigation as much as needed. If you recall at the time, by the way, right around the same newspaper publication from the New York Times, Israel was very mad at the UN committee probing Hamas sexual atrocities against Israeli women, calling them Hamas and also anti-Semitic. This is a normal part of the process for truth-seeking. Why would you go against this investigation by the United Nations? Please understand that there is a likelihood of sexual violence that occurred on October 7th. Make no mistake. The fact that they would stand against that, the Israeli government would stand against that and claim that the UN investigation is akin to having Hamas leader investigate the sex crimes himself, is fucking ridiculous. It is ridiculous. You have to understand. Can you imagine in a circumstance where you have been victimized and you want there to be some legal repercussions for the perpetrators, and then the criminal justice system comes in and they're like, okay, we're going to take a look at this. Like we are taking your allegations very seriously. We are going to conduct an investigation. And you go, no, you fucking hate me. You can't conduct an investigation. You just have to take what I said and immediately do something, which we are doing ourselves. And you should just step aside as we do the thing that we're doing in retaliation. Just remember that. That is incredible, in my opinion. Let's get back to the article by The Intercept. Shortly after the war broke out, some editors and reporters complained that time standards barred them from referring to Hamas as terrorists. The rationale from the Standards Department, run for 14 years by Philip Corbett, had long been that Hamas was the de facto administrator of a specific territory rather than a stateless terror group. Deliberately killing civilians, went the argument, was not enough to label a group terrorist, as that label could apply quite broadly, including to the United States government and including to Israel, especially to Israel, for the record. But the New York Times does not apply that same rigorous standard to all groups, because when it comes to foreign policy, the New York Times is a stenographer for the State Department. That much is clear. And that has always been the case. That's why they were championing the lies about the Iraq War that brought us into the Iraq War. They are complacent. I love the New York Times. I think it's a very valuable organ of the media. I think it's a very valuable part of this process. I could not do what I do without mainstream media, without Associated Press, without the journalists. I have friends that work at these outlets. Please make no mistake. I'm not doing a classic like, fucking fake news, mainstream media is fake. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that at all. That is why I always apply media criticism and also media literacy. I always try to explain to people media literacy. It's like me holding your hand and guiding you through these news articles. The New York Times is not supposed to be a dish rag. But unfortunately, when it comes down to it, when it comes to channeling narratives that the State Department wants out there, they will absolutely do it. Corbett, after October 7th, defended the policy in the face of pressure, newsroom sources said, but he lost. On October 19th, an email went out on behalf of Executive Director Joe Kahn saying that Corbett had asked to step back from his position. After 14 years as the embodiment of time standards, Phil Corbett has told us he'd like to step back a bit and let someone else take the leading role in this crucial effort, the Times leadership explained. 3 newsroom sources said that the move was tied to the pressure he was under to soften coverage in Israel's favor. One of the social media posts that Schwartz liked, triggering the Times review, made the case that, for Israeli propaganda purposes, Hamas should be likened at all times to the Islamic State. This is a direct carbon copy of not just the American position at the time, but it was cultivated and deliberately crafted by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Hamas's ISIS was a hashtag. Hamas's ISIS was what Israel went along with post-October 7 to justify the genocidal campaign that they were engaging in. Ironic, considering that they went with Hamas's ISIS and Hamas are Nazis, when Israel has, as a matter of fact, aligned with al-Nusra at times and resembles ISIS way closer in nature, both in its colonial endeavors and also its bastardization of religion, as though it is a religious purpose that guides them. Just like ISIS tried unsuccessfully to say that they were doing this for Islam, Israel has weaponized Judaism in the most nefarious purposes to justify their atrocities. So the point I'm trying to make is that a closer comparison between ISIS would not be with Hamas, a resistance group against the apartheid regime, but instead with Israel. Yes, whether it be destruction of archaeological and cultural sites, destruction of an entire population. Since the revelations regarding Schwartz's recent social media activity, her byline has not appeared in the paper and she has not attended editorial meetings. The paper said that a review into her social media likes is ongoing. Those likes are unacceptable violations of our company policy, said a Times spokesperson. The bigger scandal may be the reporting itself, the process that allowed it to print, and the life-altering impact the reporting had for thousands of Palestinians whose deaths were justified by the alleged systematic sexual violence orchestrated by Hamas, the paper claimed to have exposed. Another frustrated Times reporter, who has also worked as an editor there, said, a lot of focus will understandably, rightfully be directed to Schwartz, but this is the most clearly poor editorial decision-making that undermines all the other great work being tirelessly done across the paper. Remember, I have like literal friends at the New York Times that have conducted very good investigations, okay, on the visual team and on other aspects of the Times coverage as it pertains to Israel-Palestine, okay? Just remember, there are people, I'm not going to reveal who they are for obvious reasons, but there are people I talk to almost on a weekly fucking basis about the ongoing issues. They have sources on the ground. It is not the entirety of the paper is not fraudulent. However, on this in this instance, they absolutely are. They absolutely are. The paper is whole cloth engaging in genocide apologia. Just remember that. The Channel 12 podcast interview with Schwartz, which The Intercept translated from Hebrew, opens a window into their controversial story and suggests that the New York Times' mission was to bolster a predetermined narrative. In a response to The Intercept's questions about Schwartz's podcast interview, a spokesperson for the New York Times walked back the blockbuster article's framing that evidence shows Hamas had weaponized sexual violence to a softer claim that there may have been systematic use of sexual assault. Times International editor Phil Pan said in a statement that he stands by the work. Mrs. Schwartz was a part of a rigorous reporting and editing process, he said. She made valuable contributions and we saw no evidence of bias in her work. We remain confident in the accuracy of our reporting and stand by the team's investigation. But as we have said, her likes of offensive and opinionated social media posts predating her work with us are unacceptable. After the story was published, Schwartz, who did not respond to a request for comment, tweeted to thank the Times for standing behind the important stories we have published. She added, "The recent attacks against me will not deter me from continuing my work." Addressing her social media activity, Schwartz said, "I understand why people who do not know me were offended by the inadvertent like I pressed on 10/7, and I apologize for that. At least 3 of her likes have been subject of public scrutiny." In the podcast interview, Schwartz details her extensive reports to get confirmation from Israeli hospitals, rape crisis centers, trauma recovery facilities, and sex assault hotlines in Israel, as well as her inability to get a single confirmation from any of them. This part is very important. This is why I am stating that this does not meet the muster of the paper of record. Okay? She was told there had been no complaints made of sexual assaults, the Times spokesperson acknowledged after Intercept brought the Channel 12 podcast episode to the paper's attention. The fact that you did not get a single confirmation and then turned around and still reported on the matter, and the New York Times published it with a title such as Where is it? Where is it? Where the fuck is it? Oh, here. Screams without words how Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th is insane. Okay? It's unacceptable. This is not the op-ed piece. This is not an opinion piece. This is not the editorial side of the New York Times. This is supposed to be real reporting. And if real reporting falls apart and it is this biased, then what can you trust? Obviously, it is impossible to remain neutral. I get that. That's why I openly tell you what my biases are when I'm engaging in commentary. Although the editorial team that is supposed to be openly biased will refuse to acknowledge that. However, on the objective reporting side, there is a standard that must be applied. And the New York Times often is supposed to apply said standard. They do in other articles. The fact that they did not here is insane. This is one of the most consequential stories that they brought forward, where they openly acknowledged that there was no independent confirmation. That's crazy. She was told there had been no complaints made of sexual assaults. The Times spokesperson acknowledged after Intercept brought the Channel 12 podcast episode to the paper's attention. This, however, was just the very first step of her research. She then describes the unfolding of evidence, testimonies, and eventual evidence that there may have been systematic use of sexual assault, the spokesperson asserted. She details her research steps and emphasizes the Times' strict standards to corroborate evidence and meetings with reporters and editors to discuss probing questions and think critically about the story. The question has never been whether individual acts of sexual assault may have occurred on October 7. Rape is not uncommon in war, and there were also several hundred civilians who poured into Israel from Gaza that day in a second wave, contributing to and participating in the mayhem and violence. This much is true. The central issue is whether the New York Times presented solid evidence to support its claim that there were newly reported details establishing the attacks against women were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of gender-based violence on October 7, a claim stated in the headline that Hamas deliberately deployed sexual violence as a weapon of war. Anyway, this goes into detail about like all of her research. And by the way, as it stands now, I'm almost certain that I think, if I'm not, I think CNN is still trying to do a separate documentary on October 7, specifically as it pertains to coordinated efforts of sexual violence conducted by Hamas and other Palestinian militancy. As Israeli, I support Israel. Listen, brother, there are plenty of Israelis in this chat, okay? They recognize the reality. They recognize that Israel is an apartheid state. They recognize that Israel is doing a genocidal campaign in Gaza. I urge you to, I don't know, reach out to some real Israeli leftists, okay? Instead of unconditionally defending and supporting a fascist, Judeo-supremacist, apartheid regime currently engaging in an ethnic cleansing campaign. Plenty, only 2 guys, and the only left is in Israel. Doesn't matter. There's not only 2 guys. Anyway. I was born in the United States of America. There has never been a moment where I have ever defended American imperialism. You don't have to either. Okay? The manager told, the sexual assault hotline manager told that there were no reports of sexual violence. She described the call as a crazy in-depth conversation where she pressed for specific cases. Did anyone call you? Did you hear anything? How could it be that you didn't? As Schwartz began her own efforts to find evidence of sexual assault, the first specific allegations of rape began to emerge. A person identified in anonymous media interviews as a paramedic from the Israeli Air Force Medical Unit 669 claimed he saw evidence that 2 teenage girls at Kibbutz Nahal Oz had been raped and murdered in their bedroom. The man made other outrageous claims, however, that called his report into question. He claimed another rescuer pulled out of the garbage a baby who'd been stabbed multiple times. He also said he had seen Arabic sentences that were written on entrances of houses with the blood of the people that were living in the houses. No such messages exist, and the story of the baby in the trash can has been debunked. The bigger problem was that no 2 girls at the kibbutz fit the source's description. In future interviews, he changed the location to Kibbutz Be'eri, but no victims killed there matched the description either, as Mondo Weiss reported. After seeing these interviews, Schwartz started calling people at Kibbutz Be'eri and other kibbutzim that were targeted on October 7 in an effort to track down the story. Nothing. There was nothing, she said. No one saw or heard anything. She then reached a Unit 69 paramedic who relayed to Schwartz the same story he had told other media outlets, which she says convinced her there was systematic nature to the sexual violence. I say, okay, so it happened. One person saw it happen in Be'eri. Remember, claims that were already disproven. Claims that have not been proven at all, and other claims he had made that were utterly ridiculous and disproven instantly. So it can't just be one person because it's 2 girls. It's sisters. It's in the room. Something about it is systematic. Something about it feels to me that it's not random. Schwartz concluded on the podcast. Schwartz said she then began a series of extensive conversations with Israeli officials from Zakah. Now, Zakah is important because the private ultra-Orthodox rescue organization was documented to have mishandled evidence, spread multiple false stories about the events of October 7, including debunked allegations of Hamas operatives beheading babies, cutting the fetus from a pregnant woman's body. Its workers are not trained forensic scientists or crime scene experts. When we go into a house, we use our imagination, said Yossi Landau, a senior Zakah official, describing the group's work at October 7 attack sites. Not only that, but the Israeli media, Hebrew Israeli media, very clearly conducted deep investigations, and these are not outlets that are anti-Zionist in nature, about the incredulous claims made by Zakah and how self-interested they were in fundraising after October 7. Zakah, sorry. Additional irony to this, the dark irony here, is that the cutting off the fetus from a pregnant woman's body did happen. It happened in Lebanon at the hands of phalangist, Christian, fascist militias that were operating alongside the IDF. It happened to a Palestinian woman living in a refugee camp. So that is a real thing that happened in Sabra and Shatila, the massacres that occurred there. Using it as furthering your October 7 atrocity porn is disgusting. Same with the baby in the oven story. If you recall, another story from October 7 was that babies were thrown into the oven in kibbutzim. Babies were not thrown into the oven in kibbutzim on October 7. Babies, Palestinian babies, were thrown in an oven, according to first-hand testimony from both the terrorist Israeli brigades pre-Israel, obviously, pre-formation of Israel, from Irgun and Lihi militias that were self-declared terrorist organizations, mind you, in Deir Yassin, in a Palestinian village. In one of the acts conducted as a part of Plan Dalit, an organized effort to ethnically displace millions of Palestinians from their ancestral homes. Its workers are not trained. They let their imaginations run wild. The bodies were telling us what happened. That's what happened. Landau is featured in the Times report, though no mention is made of his well-documented track record of disseminating sensational stories of atrocities that were later proven false. Schwartz said that in her initial reviews, Zakah members did not make any specific allegations of rape, but described the general condition of the bodies they said they saw. We saw naked women, or we saw women without underwear, both naked without underwear, and tied with zip ties, and sometimes not zip ties, sometimes a rope or a string of a hoodie. Schwartz continued to look for evidence at various sites of attack and found no witnesses to corroborate stories of rape. And so I searched a lot in the kibbutzim, and apart from this testimony of the Israeli military paramedic, and additionally here and there, Zakah people, the stories didn't emerge from there, she said. So she continued to work the phones with rescue officials. Schwartz then saw interviews that international news channels began airing with Shari Mendez, an American architect who serves in a rabbinical unit of the IDF. Mendez, who was deployed to a morgue to prepare bodies for the burial after October 7 attacks, claimed to have seen voluminous evidence of sexual assaults. What did this fucking guy say? Misha Rub, as an Israeli soldier who participated in this war and thankfully killed many Hamas terrorists, you really should thank Israel for this war, and it would help both sides to not have Hamas in Gaza. Free Gaza from Hamas, says Misha Rub. I wish you a life that you have already created for yourself, where you will piss yourself to sleep every single fucking night as the cries of the Palestinian children that you ruthlessly slaughtered will haunt you in perpetuity. Have fun. You know, that's going to happen. It's going to happen anyway. See you in the next 10 years when you're fucking crying to the Knesset in a testimony about how you piss your fucking pants and the children that you murdered haunt you every single fucking day. I can't believe you just so openly fucking admit that you're a giant piece of shit to 21,000 people. You're just a monster. It's great. Most likely not real. There's no shot that that's a real person who actually is doing that. We saw evidence of rape, Mendez stated in one interview. Pelvises were broken, and it probably takes a lot to break a pelvis. And this was among grandmothers down to small children. This is not just something we saw on the internet. We saw these bodies with our own eyes. Mendez has been a ubiquitous figure in the Israeli government and major media narratives on sexual violence on October 7, despite the fact that she has no medical or forensic credentials to legally determine rape. She was also spoken about other violence on October 7, telling Daily Mail in October, a baby was cut out of a pregnant woman and beheaded, and then the mother was beheaded. No pregnant woman died that day, according to the official Israeli list of those killed in the attacks, and the independent research collective October 7 Fact Check said Mendez's story was false. The issue here is that there is enough atrocities that occurred on October 7 that if you just kept it to the reality, there is enough. There's just not enough to continue Israel's genocidal campaign. That's it. There's enough to whip people into a frenzy, okay? But there just isn't enough for a 5-month-long genocide, a slow burn, as the entirety of Gaza is razed. And that's the problem. Ridiculous. And we have seen this time and time again, for the record. Okay? This has happened in during the Reconstruction era. This has happened to black people in America quite frequently in an effort to garner attention and whip people into a frenzy, into engaging in lynch mobs, mass lynching campaigns. Okay? This is the false narrative that was presented that happened in the Tulsa massacre. A lie was told about a black man whistling at a white woman, which led to the Tulsa massacre, which is still to this day, by some unfortunately white supremacist historians, as a Tulsa race riot. It's not a race riot at all. It was one of the first instances where bombs were dropped domestically on top of a bustling black neighborhood, also known as Black Wall Street. It was a pogrom, a slaughter. Bombs from airplanes were dropped on top of a black neighborhood. It's also happened in 1985 in Pennsylvania in the Move bombing, but, you know, it's just this is atrocity propaganda that has been used time and time again. This was done in Iraq as well. It is a way to launder a convenient narrative to an audience that wants to feel like the actions that a state is engaging in, no matter how genocidal, no matter how bloodthirsty, is righteous. People want to feel good about the bombing campaign. After Schwartz saw interviews with Mendez, she was further convinced that the systematic rape narrative was true. I'm like, wow, what is this? She recalled. And it feels to me like it's starting to approach a plurality, even if you don't know which numbers to put on it yet. At the same time, this is what happens when you have motivated reasoning, by the way. At the same time, Schwartz said she felt conflicted at times, wondering if she was becoming convinced of the truth of the overarching story, precisely because she was looking for evidence to support the claim. I kept wondering all the time whether if I just hear about rape and see rape and think about it, whether that's just because I'm leading toward that, she said. She pushed those doubts aside. By the time Schwartz interviewed Mendez, the IDF reservist story had ricocheted around the world and had been conclusively debunked. No baby was cut from the mother and beheaded, yet Schwartz and the New York Times would go on to rely on Mendez's testimony, as well as other witnesses with track records of making unreliable claims and lacking forensic credentials. No mention was made of questions about Mendez's credibility. How Schwartz landed in such an extraordinary position at a crucial moment in the war is not entirely clear. Prior to joining the Times as a stringer last fall, her nephew Sella was a freelance journalist covering stories on issues ranging from food, photography, and culture to peace efforts, economics, and the occupation. According to his LinkedIn profile, Sella's first collaboration with Gettleman, published on October 14th, was a look at the trauma experienced by students at a university in southern Israel. For Schwartz, her first byline landed on November 14th. What is this? Took empty box to recycling instead of throwing it in the trash chute. What? Okay, I don't. Why is this relevant right now? We're doing something super serious. Okay. Anyway, Israeli police officials shared more evidence on Tuesday of atrocities committed during October 7 Hamas-led attacks, saying that they had collected testimonies from more than 1,000 witnesses and survivors about sexual violence and other abuses, Schwartz reported. The story went on to quote Israeli police chief Kobi Shabtai, explaining a litany of evidence of gruesome killings and sexual assaults on October 7. This is the most extensive investigation the state of Israel has ever known, Shabtai said in the Schwartz article, promising ample evidence would soon be provided. When the Times later produced its definitive Screams Without Words investigation, however, Schwartz and her partners reported that, contrary to Shabtai's claim, forensic evidence of sexual violence was non-existent. Non-existent. Without acknowledging the past statements by Shabtai in the Times, the paper reported that quick funerals in accordance with Jewish tradition meant evidence was not preserved. Unnamed experts told the Times that sexual violence in wars often leaves limited forensic evidence. On the podcast, Schwartz said her next step was to go to a new holistic therapy facility established to address the trauma of October 7 victims, particularly those who endured the carnage at the Nova Music Festival. Opened a week after the attacks, the facility began welcoming hundreds of survivors where they would seek counseling, do yoga, and receive alternative medicine, as well as acupuncture, sound healing, and reflexology treatments. They called it Merhav Marpe, or healing space. In multiple visits to the healing space, Schwartz again said in the podcast interview that she found no direct evidence of rapes or sexual violence. She expressed frustration with therapists and counselors at the facility, saying they engaged in a conspiracy of silence. Everyone, even those who heard these kinds of things from people they felt were very committed to their patients, or even just the people who assisted their patients, not to reveal things, she said. In the end, Schwartz came away with only innuendo and general statements from the therapist about how people process trauma, including sexual violence and rape. She said potential victims might be ashamed to speak out, experiencing survivor's guilt, or were still in shock. Perhaps also because Israeli society is conservative, there was some inclination to keep silent about this issue of sexual abuse, Schwartz speculated. On top of this, there is probably the added dimension of the religious national aspect, that this was done by a terrorist, by someone from Hamas, she added. There were lots and lots of layers that made it so they didn't speak. So every step of the process, when she was conducting her investigation, she found that there was no evidence, and oftentimes evidence that disproved the prior narrative that she was motivated to establish. She even recognized that she was motivated to establish this, by the way, and yet still went along with the fact that there's no evidence. It must mean that there is evidence, as a matter of fact. But it was not a matter of fact at all. It was a matter of opinion. According to the published Times article, two therapists said they were working with a woman who was gang raped at the rave and was in no condition to talk to investigators or reporters. Schwartz said she had focused on the kibbutzim because she had initially determined it was unlikely sexual assaults had occurred at the Nova Music Festival. I was very skeptical that it happened at the area of the party because everyone I spoke to among the survivors told me about a chase, a race like moving from place to place, she recalled. How would they have had the time to mess with a woman? Like, it is impossible. Either you hide or you die. Also, it's public, the Nova, such an open space. My coworkers always laugh at me when I say it's an apartheid state. What is the one best example I can prove it to them? Use the Israeli Israeli NGO, B'Tselem, or Amnesty International, and their coverage on why Israel is an apartheid state. Everyone, here's the thing. This is why I am. Like, this is why I'm very stubborn, but I guess my stubbornness works in this situation. This is why I regularly fucking talk about how false narratives can be presented as truth, and then the broader population that does not have access to, like, readily available information will just, like, reaffirm the calculated messages that they are seeing from the media. The New York Times doesn't call it an apartheid state, so it mustn't be that. But it doesn't matter. In some ways, you get to, yes, watch an echo chamber form and operate in real time. That's why I think, like, regardless of the constant, endless conflict coverage in real time, can lead to me even misspeaking from time to time, which happens, but it happens very rarely. And I immediately clarify. One of the most significant parts of what I do is to show you in real time how violence is contextualized by the Israeli Defense Force in real time on CNN and many other outlets, and how you whitewash a genocidal campaign that is like genocidal in broad daylight, by the way, just clear cut. Schwartz watched interviews given to international media outlets by Roz Cohen, who attended the Nova Festival. A veteran of Israel's special forces, Cohen did multiple interviews about a rape he claimed to have witnessed. A few days after the attacks, he told PBS NewsHour that he had witnessed multiple rapes. The terrorists people from Gaza raped girls, and after they raped them, they killed them, murdered them with knives, or the opposite, killed, and after they raped, they did that, he said in an appearance on CNN on January 4. He described seeing one rape and said the assailants were 5 guys, 5 civilians from Gaza, normal guys, not soldiers, not Nukba, referring to Hamas's elite commando force. It was regular people from Gaza with regular, normal clothes. In Cohen's interview with Schwartz for The Times, he said he then saw 5 men wearing civilian clothes, all carrying knives, and one carrying a hammer, dragging a woman across the ground. She was young, naked, and screaming. They all gathered around her, Mr. Cohen said. She's standing up. They start raping her. I saw the men standing in half circle around her. One penetrates her, she screams. I still remember her voice, screams without words. Then one of them raises a knife, he said, and they just slaughtered her. Yeah, Rokana questioning Lloyd Austin, I saw. We'll do that in a little bit. Let's finish this article. It was this interview that gave The Times its title, Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7. That Cohen had described alleged assailants as not being members of Hamas undermines the headline, but it remains unchanged. The Times did not address Cohen's earlier claims that he witnessed multiple rapes. Schwartz said in the podcast interview that since The Times insisted on at least 2 sources, she asked Cohen to give her the contact information of the other people he was hiding with in the bush so she could corroborate his story of the rape. She recalled, Roz hides. In the bush next to him lies his friend Shoam. They get to this bush. There are 2 other people on either side looking to the other direction and another 5th person. 5 people in the same bush. Only Roz sees all the things he sees. Everyone else is looking in a different direction. Despite saying on the podcast that only Cohen witnessed the event and the others were looking in different directions, in the Times story, Shoam Gueda is presented as a corroborating witness to the rape. He said he saw at least 4 men step out of the van and attack the woman, who ended up between their legs. He said that they were talking, giggling, and shouting, and that one of them had stabbed her with a knife repeatedly, literally butchering her. Gueda did not mention witnessing a rape in an interview he did with the NBC News on October 8th, a day after the attack. But he did describe seeing a woman murdered with a knife. We saw terrorists killing people, burning cars, shouting everywhere, Gueda told NBC. If you just say something, if you make any noise, you'll be murdered. Gueda subsequently deployed to Gaza with the IDF and has posted many videos on TikTok of himself rummaging through Palestinian homes. Cohen and Gueda did not respond to any requests for comment. This independent site, October 7 Fact Check, Mondo Weiss, and journalist Ali Abunimah of Electronic Intifada and Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone have flagged numerous inconsistencies and contradictions in the stories told in the Times report, including the account of Cohen, who had initially said he chose not to look, but he could hear them laughing constantly. Under pressure internally to defend the veracity of the story, the Times reassigned Gettleman, Schwartz, and Sella to effectively re-report the story, resulting in an article published on January 29th. Cohen declined to speak to them, they reported. Asked this month why he had not mentioned rape at first, Mr. Cohen cited the stress of his experience and said that in a text message that he had not realized then that he was one of the few surviving witnesses. He declined to be interviewed again, saying he was working to recover from the trauma he suffered. In addition to Cohen's testimony, Schwartz said on Channel 12 podcast that she also watched a video of an interrogation of a Palestinian prisoner taken by the IDF, whom she had described girls being dragged by Palestinian attackers to a wood near the Nova Festival. If you are a real journalist, you would know, because Electronic Intifada has no reason or bias to lie, right? So that's actually really funny copium coming from you, chatter, because that's the only instance where Electronic Intifada is ever mentioned or Gray Zone is ever mentioned in this article. Because the reality of the matter is that this article from The Intercept is simply covering what the information that was presented and how it was not corroborated and as a matter of fact, in many instances, was actually immediately discredited. Evidence to the contrary was presented. So you can cope and try to desperately say, well, electronic intifada has a reason to be biased, okay? But that's the first mention in this entire article, and it has nothing to do with the rest of the veracity of the claims at all. I have been very careful. I've been very careful in general, rarely ever talking about electronic intifada or the gray zone in my coverage, because I know that I have a broader audience that will immediately be dissuaded by the information that I'm presenting because of people like yourself. You will immediately go, they have intifada in the name. They're biased. Their biases do not change the reality, or rather, the lack thereof in this New York Times story. Especially important. Especially important. Are they anti-Semitic? No. This is especially important to understand when a lot of the veracity of these claims were disproven, destroyed by Israeli outlets that are Zionist outlets, for the record. That is why, while there is a sea of ridiculous articles that come out of even Haaretz and many other places like Ynet, they still do real reporting, oftentimes infinitely better than the New York Times. Anyway, Rotary V, thank you for the 10 gifted subs. The fact that she even had the audacity to bring up Palestinian interrogations as a viable source of accurate truth is insane. People in Israel understand that those interrogations are not real. It's not done to actually arrive at the truth. It's done under torturous conditions. It's done specifically to humiliate the Palestinians. That's why they'll make people go, yes, we were behaving exactly like ISIS. I'm a Hamas person, and I believe Hamas is ISIS. The fuck? Laughable that a serious journalist would look at that and go, this must be real. It's corroborated by forced confessions under torture? Really? Incredible. I don't even think J-Post would fucking even look at the torture interrogation videos and be like, see, it's real. Like, that's crazy. Palestinian attackers in the woods near Nova Festival. She was also moved, she said, by a clip of an interview she watched in November at a press conference hosted by Israeli officials that became the focus of her First Times article. An account named Sapir describes a lurid scene of rape and mutilation, and Schwartz said she became fully convinced that there was a systematic program of sexual violence by Hamas. Her testimony is crazy and hair-raising and huge and barbaric, Schwartz said. And it's not just rape. It's rape and amputation. And I realized a bigger story than I imagined. With many locations and the pictures start to emerge, what is going on here? Times report states that they interviewed Sapir for 2 hours at a cafe in southern Israel, and she described witnessing multiple rapes, including an incident where one attacker rapes a woman with another, cuts off her breast with a box cutter. That's where the fucking breast narrative came from. At the press conference in November, Israeli authorities said they were collecting and examining forensic materials that would confirm Sapir's specifically detailed accounts. Police say they are still gathering evidence from rape victims in addition to eyewitnesses to build the strongest case possible, said a correspondent who covered the press event. Such a scene would produce significant amounts of physical evidence, yet Israeli officials have to date been unable to provide it. I have circumstantial evidence, but in the end, it is my duty to find supporting evidence for her story and discover the victims' identities, said Superintendent Adi Edri, the Israeli official leading the investigation into sexual violence on October 7. A week after the Times report went online, at this stage, I have no specific bodies. In the Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz is asked if firsthand testimonies of women who survived rape on October 7 exist. I can't really speak about this, but the vast majority of women who had been sexually assaulted on October 7 were shot immediately after. And that's where the big numbers are, she replied. The majority are corpses. Some women managed to escape and survive. She added, I do know that there's a very significant element of disassociation when it comes to sexual assault. So a lot of times they don't remember. They don't remember everything. They remember fragments of the events, and they can't always describe how they ended up on the road and how they were rescued. In early December, Israeli officials launched an intensive public campaign accusing the international community and specifically feminist leaders of standing silent in the face of the widespread systematic sexual violence of Hamas on October 7. The PR effort was rolled out at the United Nations on December 4th with an event hosted by the Israeli ambassador. This was a coordinated full-scale PR campaign to do atrocity propaganda. Okay? With an event hosted by Israeli ambassador and the former Meta executive Sheryl Sandberg. The feminist organizations targeted by the pro-Israel figures were caught flat-footed as charges of sexual violence had not yet circulated widely. Sandberg was also quoted attacking women's rights organizations in a December 4th New York Times article, headlined, What We Know About Sexual Violence During the October 7 Attacks on Israel, and whose publication coincided with the launch of the PR campaign at the UN. The article, also reported by Gettleman, Schwartz, and Seller, relied on claims made by Israeli officials and acknowledged the Times had not yet been able to corroborate the allegations. A revealing correction was subsequently appended to the story. An earlier version of this article misstated the kind of evidence Israeli police have gathered in investigating accusations of sexual violence committed on October 7 in the attack by Hamas against Israel. The police are relying mainly on witness testimony, not on autopsies or forensic evidence. Just a marginal correction on one of the most important pieces of key evidence that either credits or discredits the entire fucking story. Israel promised it had extraordinary amounts of eyewitness testimony. Investigators have gathered tens of thousands of testimonies of sexual violence committed by Hamas on October 7, according to the Israeli police, including at the site of the music festival that was attacked. Schwartz, Gettleman, and Stella reported on December 4th. Those testimonies never materialized. Benjamin Netanyahu hammered on the theme in December 5th on a speech where he said, I say to the women's rights organizations, to the human rights organizations, you've heard of the rape of Israeli women, horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation. Where the hell are you? The same day, President Joe Biden gave a speech in which he said, the world can't just look away. What's going on? It's on all of us, the government, international organizations, civil society, individual citizens, to forcefully condemn the sexual violence of Hamas terrorists without exception. The 2-month-long Times investigation was still being edited and revised, Schwartz said in the podcast, when she started to feel concerned about the timing. So I said, we're missing momentum. Maybe the UN isn't addressing sexual assault because no media outlet will come out with a declaration about what happened there. If the Times story doesn't publish soon, she said, it may no longer be interesting. Schwartz said the delay was explained to her internally as, we don't want to make people sad before Christmas. She also said the Israeli police sources were pressuring her to move quickly to publish. She said, they asked her, what does the New York Times not believe? There were sexual assaults here? Schwartz felt she was in the middle. I'm also in this place. I'm also an Israeli, but I also work for the New York Times, she said. So all the time, I'm like in this place between the hammer and the anvil. The December 28th article, Screams Without Words, opened with a story of Gal Abdush, described by the Times as the woman in the black dress. Video of her charred body appeared to show her bottomless. Israeli police officials said they believed that Ms. Abdush was raped. The Times reported the article labeled Abdush a symbol of the horrors visited upon Israeli women and girls on the October 7 attacks. The Times report mentions WhatsApp messages from Abdush and her husband to their family, but doesn't mention that some family members believe that the crucial messages make the Israeli officials' claims implausible. As Mondo Weiss later reported, Abdush texted the family at 6:51 a.m. saying they were in trouble at the border. At 7, her husband messaged to say she'd been killed, her family saying the charring came from a grenade. Doesn't make any sense, said Abdush's sister, that in a short time span they raped her, slaughtered her, and burned her. Speaking about the rape allegation, her brother-in-law said the media invented it. The extent of which the New York Times, this is one of the most damning, they buried the lead here, by the way. This is also one of the most gruesome, disgusting parts of this story. They reported it uncritically and then had the family have to come out and relive the trauma and to yell at the New York Times for potentially using her as a singular example. Another relative suggested the family was pressured under false pretenses to speak with the reporters. Abdush's sister wrote on Instagram that the Times reporters mentioned they want to write a report in memory of Gal, and that's it. If we knew that the title would be about rape and butchery, we'd never accept that. In its follow-up story, the Times sought to discredit her initial comment, quoting Abdush's sister as saying she had been confused about what happened and was trying to protect my sister. They went as far as to ridicule the immediate family members of the victim. The woman who filmed Abdush on October 7 told the Israeli news site Ynet that Schwartz and Sella had pressured her into giving the paper access to her photos and videos for the purpose of serving Israeli propaganda. They called me again and again and explained how important it is to Israeli Hasbara, she recalled, using the terms for public diplomacy, which in practice refers to Israeli propaganda efforts directed at international audiences. That is one of the people who filmed it, an Israeli person who filmed it. At every turn, when the New York Times reporters ran into obstacles confirming tips, they turned to anonymous Israeli officials or witnesses who'd already been interviewed repeatedly in the press. Months after setting off on their assignment, the reporters found themselves exactly where they had begun, relying overwhelmingly on the word of Israeli officials, soldiers, and Zaka workers to substantiate their claim that more than 30 bodies of women and girls were discovered with signs of sexual abuse. On the Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz said the last remaining piece she needed for the story was a solid number from the Israeli authorities about any possible survivors of sexual violence. We have 4, and we can stand behind that number, she said she was told by the Ministry of Welfare and Social Affairs. No details were provided. The Times story ultimately reported there were at least 3 women and 1 man who were sexually assaulted and survived. When the story was finally published on December 28th, Schwartz described the flood of emotions and reactions online and in Israel. First of all, in the paper, we gave it a very, very prominent place, which is, apropos all my fears, there is no greater show of confidence than being put on the front page, she said. In Israel, the reactions are amazing. Here, I think I was given closure, seeing all the media treat the article and treat it something of a thank you for putting a number on it. Thank you for saying there were many cases, that it was a pattern. Thank you for giving it a title which suggests that maybe there is some organizing logic behind it. That this is not some isolated act of some person acting on his own initiative. Times staffers who spoke to The Intercept on the condition of anonymity for fear of professional reprisal described the Screams Without Word article as the product of the same mistakes that led to the disastrous editor note and retraction of Rukmini Callimachi's podcast Caliphate and print series on the Islamic State group. Khan, the current executive editor, was widely known as the promoter and protector of Callimachi. The reporting, which the Times determined in an internal review was not subjected to sufficient scrutiny by top editors and fell short of the paper's standards, on ensuring accuracy, had been a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. That honor, along with other prestigious awards, was rescinded in the wake of the scandal. Margaret Sullivan, the last public editor for the New York Times to serve a full term before the paper discarded the position in 2017, said that she hopes such an investigation will be launched into the Screams Without Words story. I sometimes joke it is another good day not to be the New York Times public editor, but the organization could really use one right now to investigate on behalf of the readers, she wrote. At some story meetings, Schwartz said on the Channel 12 podcast, guests with Middle East expertise were there to offer probing questions. I need you to understand something here. I'm going to pause briefly, and I'm going to serve the top of the hour ad break, and I'm going to say something that's very important here. Retractions and endless professional scrutiny into the New York Times reporting is incredibly important, because without it, a fundamental plank of democracy falls. I know we often talk about theoretical democracy, democracy in theory in the United States of America, and how it's not real. But journalism is incredibly important, okay? As much as I make jokes, journalism is incredibly fucking important. And without this level of scrutiny, without retractions, all of a sudden, every outlet turns into the New York Post. Okay? This has to happen, because if this doesn't happen, if there are no real retractions, you lose credibility. Credibility is desperately needed for mainstream press right now. Legacy publishers are at an all-time low in terms of maintaining credibility. It blows my mind that at a time when misinformation runs rampant all over the internet, the paper of record, what we use to archive American history, could come out with a dish rag-like story such as this one that is unsubstantiated, uncorroborated, and is just straight up propaganda. Unimaginable. I can't believe it. The very same New York Times that is basically repeating the same mistakes, which I don't even think it's a mistake. I think it's by design. It's doing the very same things that it did in the lead up to the Iraq War. I don't know. It's pretty believable. Sorry, man. Will Miniker says, now we know New York Times' Hamas mass rape hoax, which was like New York Times' Iraqi WMD hoax, directly killed thousands of Arabs, which was order from the top. New York Times editor sent pro-war extremist Amar Schwartz and her nephew out on an Afikaman hunt for a story already pre-written. Like Judith Miller's Iraq War lies, this has to be understood not as a failure of the New York Times and its leadership, but the fulfillment of what they exist to do. They're willing to live with the embarrassment to do so, to do what they see as their duty. I think it's a pretty valid take. Afikoman? I don't know what that means. No one knows about the Naira Gulf War story, I guess. No, we know. I've talked about it. The lengths that they went to. You're talking about the baby incubator story, famously, right? That's the one. I've covered it. Yeah. in the lead up to the Gulf War. Yeah. The baby incubator, afikaman, is a piece of matzah you hide during Passover. Oh, okay. Yeah. What is that story? I've never heard of it. You never heard of it because it was used, packaged, laundered in order to justify the Gulf War, and then very quickly found to be just bullshit. But what is really interesting about it is that they even fucking went to the lengths of like having, the Kuwaiti diplomat's daughter saying that Iraqi forces were throwing babies that were in incubators, ripping them out of their incubators and throwing them out of windows. If you want to see real babies in incubators get murdered ruthlessly, by the way, the Israeli occupying forces done that in almost every single fucking hospital in Gaza, by the way. You are rich. You live in a rich part of LA. You are out of touch. If you think you're a journalist with credibility, then do some streams living in Muslim areas of a Western city and go out in the evening, go to London and report properly. I think this guy's pretty funny and doesn't know that I am a Muslim and grew up in a Muslim country for longer than I have lived in the United States of America. But yeah. Londonistan, mate. Fucking hell. Londonistan, they've got halal meats, lad. I don't like it. I don't fucking like it, mate. Go out at fucking night, yeah, and see Islamic law and the Islamic ray guns directly with your own fucking eyes, mate. Londonistan has turned into a fucking no-go zone. Halal meat for all the eyes to fucking see, yeah? How many years were you in Turkey in comparison to the U.S.? 18. First 18 years of my life. Take the fucking Hajj to London. It's like Mecca, yeah? Mecca. Anyway. Times reporters and guests who are concerned with Middle East affairs coming from all kinds of places in the world, they ask you questions that challenge you. And it's excellent that they do that because you yourself all the time, like, you don't believe yourself for a moment. Those questions were challenging to answer, she said. One of the questions you get asked, and it's the hardest one not to be able to answer, is if this had happened in so many places, how can it be that there is no forensic evidence? How can it be that there is no documentation? How can it be that there are no records, a report, an Excel spreadsheet? You're telling me about Shari Mendez. That's someone who saw with their own eyes and is now and is now speaking to you. Is there no written report to make what she's saying authoritative? The host interjected, and you went at that stage to those official Israeli authorities and they gave you something, anything. How did you respond? There is nothing, Schwartz said she was told. There was no collection of evidence from the scene. But broadly, she said, the editors were fully behind the project. There was no skepticism on their part ever, she claimed. It still doesn't mean I had the story because I didn't have a second source for many things. I think we all understand why a second source is a necessity, right? A verifiable second source that is clear in their testimony. Eyewitness testimony oftentimes, not even during war, in like a regular fucking civilian setting, okay? An act of terror, is going to be very hard to get good evidence out of. Witnesses are notoriously unreliable. But you definitely need to have at least a second witness to corroborate. You need forensic evidence. You need actual evidence. You're basically at that point operating like a judge, jury, and executioner. And they didn't even do that. They couldn't even do that. A Times spokesperson pointed out this portion of the interview as evidence of the paper's rigorous process. We have reviewed the wider transcript, and it's clear you're persisting in taking quotes out of context. In the portion of the interview you refer to, Anat describes being encouraged by editors to corroborate evidence and sources before we publish the investigation. Later, she discusses regular meetings with editors where they would ask hard and challenging questions. Yeah, except she said she didn't have it. So your rigorous reporting process doesn't fucking mean anything if you don't actually follow through on it and you still publish it. It's an Ouroboros. You're basically saying, well, the fact that they asked these questions implies that we have a rigorous process. Okay, but she didn't have answers for it, and you still went ahead and published it. So there is no rigorous reporting process at all then. Or if there is one, this did not meet the standards. And for the record, what is the New York Times doing? Oh, that's right. Are they launching an investigation over how their coverage failed? Nope. They're launching an investigation into who leaked. It's Israel-Gaza coverage reporting. Management has questioned staffers, including daily producers, after The Intercept revealed internal debate over a yet-to-air episode on Hamas weaponizing sexual violence. Such a probe is highly unusual, say staffers, one of whom dubbed it a witch hunt. That's great. It's like cop shit, dude. They're behaving like fucking cops. Wait, so you're saying that the New York Times is propaganda? The New York Times is an incredibly important outlet for journalism in this country. It is the paper of record. It is how we archive American history. Therefore, a rigorous standard must be applied. And unfortunately, in matters that pertain to American foreign policy, in key events like the lead up to the Iraq War, and in this circumstance, laundering the narrative of systematic rapes that were conducted by Hamas on October 7, the New York Times has absolutely made up their minds ahead of time before the story ever published and refused to do their journalistic due diligence. So yes, I am saying that they do engage in State Department propaganda notoriously and historically. All media is propaganda, of course, but there can be propaganda for the truth and there can be falsehoods. The problem in this circumstance is that the New York Times engaged in spreading falsehoods. In her interview with Channel 12, Schwartz says she began working with Gettleman soon after October 7. My job was to help him. After the article was published, Gettleman was invited to speak on a panel about sexual violence at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. His efforts were lauded by the panel and its host, Sandberg, the former Facebook executive. Wouldn't both sides think they're telling the truth, though? Sure. But, you know, that's why you have to do the work to ensure that you are rigorously applying the same standards to your stories to ensure that you are not caught with your dick out in the fucking wind. The New York Times was, in this circumstance and in many other very important historical moments, caught with their dicks out in the wind. What we found, I don't even want to use the word evidence because evidence is almost like a legal term that suggests you're trying to prove an allegation or prove a case in court, Gettleman told Sandberg. That is not my role. We all have our roles. And my role as the document is to present information, is to give people a voice. And we found information along the entire chain of violence, so of sexual violence. Yeah, she didn't want to say she found evidence because there was none. Now, here's the thing. First thing you learn about journalism, and it's a cliche that I'm repeating, that I've repeated time and time again, even today, is that when one party says it's raining outside and the other party says it's actually sunny, the job of the journalist is not to report on both of those sides and what they're saying. The job of the journalist is to open the fucking window and see for themselves and report on that. The New York Times failed that standard of basic journalism. Literally, first day shit. They literally opened a window, saw that it was sunny, and still said, well, a lot of people are saying it's actually rainy, so I'm going to say it's rainy anyway. Gettleman said his mission was to move people. It is really difficult to get this information and then to shape it, he said. That's our job as journalists, to get the information and to share the story in a way that makes people care, not just to inform, but to move people. And that's what I've been doing for a long time. This is like an esteemed reporter, by the way. This isn't the random freelancer we're talking about now. We're talking about Gettleman. One Times reporter said colleagues are wondering what a balanced approach might look like. I'm waiting to see if the paper will report in depth, deploying the same kind of resources and means on the United Nations report that documented the horrors committed against Palestinian women. That's the end of this fucking article. Yeah, Sheryl Sandberg is the one doing the documentary. Sheryl Sandberg fronting Israeli documentary by sexual atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7. Anyway, you saw it reported on earlier today as well with respect to the food aid that was being delivered to Palestinians. By the way, Anat Schwartz, we covered it in the article, but like openly came out and tweeted that like they're standing by her.